We're going to begin Parshat Toldot, a complex parsha. Not that the others aren't, but this one has got some more complexity as well. So we'll go quickly an overview and then try and see if we can look at some things a little bit more in depth and try and learn from it. So it really spans, this is almost the entirety of Yitzchak's life. We have a little bit at the end of last week's parsha about Yitzchak, and perhaps the most enigmatic of the Avos and Imos, and the really, the Torah gives us very little about him. And it begins at his marriage at the age of 40, and it goes into at least 40 years later when the children grow up and they are in their 40s. It says at 40, Esav got married, and thereafter some time Yitzchak was old, being at least 100 at that point, and wanted to give over blessings to Esav, and the story with Yaakov coming in his place and getting the blessings, and Esav saying, "What about me? Is there nothing left for me?" etc. So it begins with the tale of the birth, the struggle to have children, and the birth of the twins, the distinction between the two. Then there's a famine again, and Yitzchak is going to leave, and Hashem says, "Don't leave the country. You have to remain in the country." And it reiterates the promise made that his descendants will have this land. Then the struggles with Gerar, and they're both in them peeking into their tent and seeing that they're a married couple, and then fighting over the wells, and the covenant made with the Canaanite king. Esav getting married, the story with the brachos, and Yaakov stepping in place of Esav, and then Esav coming in being distraught, and then Yaakov being sent away to Lavan's house. So that's an overview. Essentially, this is the entirety of what we see of Yitzchak and Rivka, other than the last few parts of last week's parsha. So I think there's a little bit to look at and see what is Yitzchak, what's Yitzchak's place within the Avos and Rivka, partnering with him in as the aim of Am Yisrael. So the parsha begins with Eila Toldos Yitzchak ben Avraham Lidas Yitzchak. It starts with a very peculiar verse, which is a great struggle to many or most of the commentators. It says, "And these are the descendants," literally translated, "of Yitzchak. Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak." Right? So obviously there's a question right there. These are the descendants of Yitzchak. You would expect to hear the story of the birth of the children, even if it wouldn't immediately say Yaakov and Esav, but it shouldn't reiterate Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak. So Rashi immediately translates, "These are the descendants of Yitzchak, or the children of Yitzchak, Yaakov and Esav," which we're about to talk about, but we're going to begin the story from chapter 1. Ibn Ezra says what it means is these are the children of Yaakov. These are the children of Yitzchak. It doesn't mean, the Ramban quotes Ibn Ezra and his own, it says it doesn't mean Avram, it doesn't mean Yaakov and Esav, because that's not what it's talking about. But rather, if you remember, we had the same thing by earlier parshas, by Noach and so on. And the reference to Toldos are not specifically the descendants, but rather the birds, that which this person brought to the world. So the Toldos we saw earlier is Iker Toldoseim Shel Tzadikim Maasim Tovim. The main births of tzaddikim, of righteous people, are Maasim Tovim, are the good deeds they bring to the world. So the birth, or the descendants, or the births brought by Yitzchak into the world is his character and who he is. And it is important to note that Avraham, holiness Yitzchak, Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak. And there's an enigmatic Rashi here about Yitzchak looking like Avraham. We have to realize that Yitzchak was a very different person than Avraham. The way we have in our tradition, Avraham is the epitome of chesed, Yitzchak is the epitome of din. Din being strict judgment. But we take that, we have to understand that, and we take that a little bit too superficially when we think like, oh, he was just a strict person, or very not so kind, any form like that. It's clear that Rashi's is indicating differently. By saying by Yitzchak, or the verse really is indicating differently. Avraham, holiness Yitzchak. Avraham, this epitome of chesed, is what birthed Yitzchak. And that's, if we're going to understand Toldos Yitzchak, we're going to understand the person that Yitzchak became, the person that Yitzchak is, the father of our nation that Yitzchak is. If we're going to understand those Toldos, we have to understand that he was a product of Avraham, of the epitome of chesed. But it came out in a different way. Its focus was different. And if we look at the next verses, and we look at the previous verses about Yitzchak, we're going to find something profound. Yitzchak, in Yiddish, we say adavener. He was someone who would pray a lot. He was someone who was meditating. What did we see about him? In the previous parsha, he went out, right? He was out lasuach basadeh, literally to speak in the field, right? But siach hasadeh as well are the plants that which grow and spontaneously almost, that which the growth of the field. There's a certain growth that he had in the contemplation, in the self, in the alone, in the very strong connection to Hashem. So much so that he's the one that couldn't leave the land. Abraham was allowed to leave the land. Yaakov was allowed to leave the land. Yitzchak could not leave the Holy Land. He was so connected to that space that he couldn't leave, as we'll see in the next section. So we're talking about Yitzchak as an outgrowth of Abraham, whose focus was on the spiritual connection, as much as Abraham's focus was on the illuminating the world for illuminating to people the connection to Hashem, allowing people to see that they individually can be connected to Hashem. Yitzchak's way was showing the direct connection that each person has through a spiritual connection with Hashem, through tefillah, through being out in the field and recognizing and seeing that. And that's why previously it was he went out lasuach basadeh. He went to the well of Be'er L'chai Ro'i, that the living one sees me. So this is the necessity to see that Avraham, the epitome of chesed, of connecting with people and connecting them to Hashem, Yitzchak was the actual action of a direct connection to Hashem. So in 25:20, he is 40 years old, and we talked about last week the various ages given for Rivka's age at the marriage: 3, 14, 16, or 36. And they obviously are there to teach you various strengths of her character and the purity of her person. What's unique here is that it reiterates. He married Rivka, the daughter of Bethuel, from Aram who was from Aram, from Padan Aram, the sister of Lavan, Ha'arami, again, three times mentioning that they are from Aram, for him for a wife. And Rashi points out to tell you that she didn't have the best role models and didn't necessarily come from the best places, but nevertheless was able to be the character that was what was needed for Yitzchak. Vayetar Yitzchak, but there's a very powerful thing here, that Hashem, as the previous parsha pointed out, that it was so obvious that she was meant and destined for Yitzchak with that story of Eliezer coming and meeting there and asking for water, and her kindness, and how she fit into Avram's home with the kindness. It all looked so clear that it was from Hashem, and yet Hashem had brought for Yitzchak a wife who was barren, as the verse says. She was an akara, a woman that could not give birth, and for 20 years they waited for a child. Why would Hashem find Yitzchak a mate that didn't? This is the father of Am Yisrael, of the nation of Yisrael. Yeah. Why find someone who's struggling to give birth? This question is asked by one of the most fascinating thinkers in 14th and 15th century in Spain, the Ran, in the Drashas Aran, Rabbeinu Nissim. Such a deep sefer, wonderful teachings. And so he asked this question, like, why was it that Hashem had arranged that kind of marriage? A woman who essentially couldn't give birth, for Yitzchak, who's supposed to be here's the promise to you. Your descendants from Yitzchak will inherit this land and they will be a great nation. And Yitzchak, here's my promise to you. Your descendants will be a great nation. And oh yes, and I found you a wife. I orchestrated this wonderful well story with Eliezer and camels and she's barren. Yeah, she can't have any kids. Like, right? What for? And the enigmatic answer that Chazal teach us, that the Midrash teaches, is Hashem desires the prayer of the righteous. And so what better way than to make them want something, right? And it's a very, almost, I remember thinking about this many years ago, and it sounded like childish, like God is a little narcissistic and needs someone to turn to him. And so here, I'm going to make you have some troubles so that you turn to me. But the truth is, it's about relationship. When you have no relationship with someone and need to take care of them, you take care of them and then you walk away because you've done it, whether it's paying a bill or whatever fulfillment that has to be done, you fulfill and you move on. But when you want to maintain a relationship, the way you cultivate that which you provide is in a manner that maintains and cultivates the relationship. I heard Rav Aaron Lapiansky once said, parents who don't want a relationship with their kid send their kid with $10,000 to college and say, go. Right? You have what you need, don't call. But parents that want to call, right, are constantly, so what do you need? And how is it? And can I send you something? And right? So obviously that's on a very different scale, different level. But the idea is for Yitzchak, whose entire, not entire, but whose depth was the ability to pray. The necessity was to cultivate that relationship of tefillah. And it is only through that to get to the ultimate, that which is needed. If it would have been granted, gifted, then that would miss the point of what Yitzchak was. The relationship of Yitzchak with Hashem is through tefillah. We see that, right, in the previous parsha. So here too, it necessitated his relationship with her through tefillah and with Hashem through tefillah. And that's why it says, Vaye'etar Yitzchak Lashem. He prayed, but in a very powerful prayer, Lenochach Ishto, and facing with a connection to his wife. Nochach is directly across with the connection. For she was an Akara. And indeed, Hashem responded to that deep connection, that deep relationship, because that was the epitome of Yitzchak, the necessity of Yitzchak's relationship with Hashem. So it wasn't Hashem saying, look, I got you now. I have you where you really need me. So I'm going to just hold out a little longer so you can pray and I can get some more prayer from you. But rather, that's the epitome of growth. That is the essence of the growth of Yitzchak and the relationship with his wife and with Hashem in prayer, in contemplating and the relationship with Hashem and the needs that he has and the purpose he has in the world. We see a similar thing with Hannah in her prayer to have a child as well, where she Chana al Hashem. She meditated and prayed upon Hashem. The idea of to think about what is my place, what is my purpose, what do I want a child for, what does it mean, my promise that Hashem gave me, that I'm going to have a nation come from us, right? All of those things need a lot of clarity of thought and relationship building with Hashem, and that's what the tefillah was needed from the master of tefillah, from Yitzchak. And so for 20 years they prayed and built their relationship with each other and Hashem through the essence of tefillah. So ultimately, their tefillahs are answered, and she becomes pregnant, and they're clearly different people. And the promise is that they are different people, but they're not just different people. They are the balance and counterbalance to each other. You can have different people, but they don't interact or don't interfere with each other. But here it says that Ul'om mila'om ye'ematz, one nation from the other nation will fight for strength. It's Esav and Yaakov are not only two people that are different. They are two people that struggle for two different entities. As hopefully we'll see next week a little more, the idea, Esav is not meant to be a bad person. Is only meant to be a counterbalance to what Yaakov is. The end result of every person is their own choices. People are only created with the propensities and the inclinations to various ways and things. But what they choose to do with that is entirely up to them. Yitzchak and Rivka had two children who were meant to do very different things, just as Rachel and Leah were meant to do very different things. And there's a midrash that says that Esav was supposed to have 12 tribes, just like Yaakov, and that Am Yisrael were meant to be a full 24 tribes. So Esav also was meant to be one of the avos, one of the fathers of Am Yisrael. Esav, so the distinction between the two is not good and bad, but rather Esav being the worldly one, the outgoer, the driven one, the red, which symbolizes life force, blood, and the action-oriented, the doer, and Yaakov was the thinker, right? The one who would be a shepherd and in the tent and study, the studious one versus the active one. Neither of those are essentially good or essentially bad, and both are necessary. But they are a counterbalance to each other. They are both fighting for a certain amount of our focus. And that's this balance and counterbalance. And unfortunately, it turned out to be where where it deviated and became completely different paths. We'll talk in a moment about the midrash about that and how that happened. But it's a very important thing for us to realize that throughout the tribes of Yaakov's children as well, some of them were more of the Yaakov and some of them were more of the Esav. In fact, Yosef replaced Esav, and therefore he had his own tribes. And Yosef was really the outgoing one, as it says at the end. He was the Yosef hu hamashbir. Yosef is the one who fed everyone, who took care of everybody's needs. That would be Esav, right? Who fed the family, and Yaakov being the studious one, or the thinker, or the shepherd. There are two different, and that balance would have brought the balance to Am Yisrael. And instead, because Esav's not being trained in how to do that, ended up Yosef needed to do Esav's job. But what happened? So there's a fascinating midrash here that it says in verse 24, 25, she gave birth to the twins, very different people, and Yitzchak is 60 years old when they give birth. Verse 27, Vayigdelu hane'arim, and the youth got older. They grew up, and Esav was a hunter, someone who a fields person, and Yaakov was a Tom, just a wholesome person sitting in the tent. Now, what's the beginning? Vayigdelu hane'arim. So Rashi quotes a midrash. It says, up until that point, nobody can tell their difference. Everybody thought they were exactly the same. When they got older, that's when they saw the distinction. So Rav Hirsch, in his Chumash commentary and in one of his essays on education, in his 7th volume in Collected Writings, says, that's precisely the mistake that happened here. Even though they looked and could have acted very differently from the beginning, their training was both the same. And both Esav and Yaakov were being trained how to pray and how to meditate and how to be a shepherd. And so Esav never got the training of how to be Esav and still connect to Hashem. He only had the training of how to be Yaakov and connect to Hashem. It was only after he had grown up, that people noticed, oh, they're different people. And this is something very important for us in our educational society, where we have 600 kids in a classroom, and everybody's given the same exact curriculum with the same exact systems, and to quote the famous person, everybody's a genius, but you can't teach a fish to climb a tree, right? The recognition or lack thereof of the distinct uniquenesses of each individual person was missing in this particular case, and therefore Esav never had the ability to learn how to be the genius that he was, how to be the ish sadeh, while maintaining the clarity of mission and the purpose and the direction of who he was meant to be. And Yitzchak wanted to be able to give that to him throughout his life, and even after Rivka had seen that he was no longer worthy of it, he wanted to give the blessings and the mission that he had received from Abraham over to Esav as well, because the character itself, the personality traits itself were not out of what was needed. In fact, it was meant to be a part of Am Yisrael. Interestingly, we'll see in next week's parsha when Yaakov marries Leah and Rachel. So the midrash says that Leah was supposed to marry Esav, and Rachel was supposed to marry Yaakov. Why? Because Leah is the spiritual one, Rachel is the more worldly one. So the counterbalance to Esav is Leah. The counterbalance to Yaakov is Rachel. And ultimately, Rachel's child has to take over Esav, Yosef, to maintain this. So these are big ideas. We'll develop them a little more in the future weeks when we see these characters come up. But it's important to recognize that the balance and counterbalance is really the necessity for us to live as Jews, both as thinkers in the mind, in the Torah, and also as people of action in the world. And not always it is the same person, but as a whole, that's the balance. So La'om Ya'amatz could have and should have been within Am Yisrael. And unfortunately, Esav did not remain within and ultimately went out and did not become a part of that heritage of Am Yisrael. The next section is where Esav plays that out. So he came back from the field one day and he was tired, and he said, "Haliteni na mina adama adamazeh." Really, the word haliteni is way animals are sometimes force-fed. So just stuff that red stuff down my throat. Okay, not perhaps appropriate. And Yaakov says to him, "Sell for me the Bechorah." Now, there's an important word here. There's a lot of criticism of Yaakov here. You're holding this man hostage. He's hungry. He's tired, and for some beans, you've had him trade his birthright away. So it actually, Hirsch points out in verse 34, it clearly says that he had already given him to eat while he made these negotiations. Look at 34. V'Yaakov nasan le'esav. It doesn't say v'nasan and then he gave, or rather, and Yaakov had given to Esav the nazid, the bean soup, and he had eaten it, and so on. So this negotiation is going on not while Yaakov is holding him and say, "Look, I'm not feeding you until you sell this to me," but actually, the Yaakov natan le'esav, he had already given to him that meal. What's going on is that Yaakov recognizes that Esav has no appreciation for the heritage. He's not selling wealth. That's not what Esav is thinking about. It was not about the money, because Esav would have asked for the money. And in fact, even Ezra is of the opinion that that Yitzchak at this point is not wealthy anymore, doesn't have a birthright. But it wasn't about that. It was about the tradition of Yaakov being the son, Yitzchak being the son of Abraham. That legacy of Abraham is what Yaakov says to him. You don't seem to want this. You're coming into the house here, having, being tired from doing work out in the field, whatever you were doing, hunting, and it's like red stuff down my throat. Sell the birthright of Yaakov, of Abraham to me. Allow me to carry this on. And Esav's response is, "Sure, I'm gonna die," meaning I got nothing to live for in that world. That's got nothing for me. And as the verse says at the end of 34, he ate, he drank, he got up, he left. Total disregard for that birthright. And this is where that change happens, where the tradition of Abraham and Sarah to Yitzchak and Rivka needs to go over to the children, and Esav says, "Yeah, there's nothing there. There's no there for me. There's nothing there for me." Vayivez Esav et habechorah. He made light of it. He despised it. It was very little for him, and it's a very sad point, because this is a point that the counterbalance within Am Yisrael becomes an external counterbalance and a struggle between the Amalek and Am Yisrael, between Haman and Am Yisrael. I mean, the descendants of Esav and the perpetuating of the ideals of fighting Am Yisrael, perhaps the underpinnings of anti-Semitism in so many ways. There's many forms of anti-Semitism, but the hating us for being a conscience to the world, right? The dislike of your thought processes and your one God and all of these things that have come up throughout our long history and sorry history. So many of it are the Esavites of the world, and that happens at this moment. At this moment, that deviation off the path and out of the family happens, or begins to happen. More happens throughout this story, but it begins to happen, and it's a very sad and sorry point for us to look at. Yitzchak and Rivka are told not to leave the land. This is in 26. Not to leave the land, and they will be blessed within the land, even though there's a famine. Verse 3 says, "Remain here, I will bless you, because to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will keep my promise that I promised to Avram your father. And I will make your descendants like the stars, and I will give you all these lands, and the nations of the world will be blessed by you through your descendants, because of Abraham keeping the teaching and your descendants keeping it as well." A tremendous blessing, but it's important to recognize that each one of the Avos, of the patriarchs, gets their own promise, a reiteration of the promise before, because each one brings a certain trait and a certain part of the totality of Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael is chesed. Am Yisrael is tefillah, is prayer and contemplation, and is personal connection. And Am Yisrael is Yaakov as well, which is a combination of two. We'll talk about that in the future weeks. But that's the ideas that we have to develop here. That Yitzchak gets his own promise for his own descendants on account of the character traits that he has as well. He's in Gerar, and the Avimelech peeks into their window and sees that they are a couple actually, and says, "Wait, I was about to take this woman as a wife, and now look what you brought upon me." Nevertheless, Yitzchak is blessed by Yizra. Yitzchak in verse 12, that land, and he got 100-fold of that which he planted, a blessing from Hashem. This is an important part of also the lessons we learn from Yitzchak. Avraham, the Midrash tells us, or the Gemara tells us, established the morning prayer to Shacharis, the morning davening. That means Avraham had blessing, wealth, leadership. He was respected. He was like the clarity of day. Yitzchak prayed the mincha prayer, the evening prayer, as the sun is setting. Yitzchak already sees the struggles the nations have with him, and yet there's blessing. There's the peeping Tom and the threats. The next section talks about every well that he dug, that they would steal from him, right? And that's of utmost necessity. There are many deep ideas about the wells, but one basic one is that Yitzchak is a foreigner in his own land. He is disrespected and attacked, really, within the space that he is, but nevertheless is blessed, and nevertheless has wealth, and nevertheless has his respect of the people, so much so that they come and say, "Hey, wait, we want to make a commitment with you because and a covenant with you, because we see ultimately you are blessed from Hashem, even though they tried to take that away." So this is already, the sun is setting, and Yaakov is already in exile by Lavan, exile in Mitzrayim, and the beginning of exile. And And so he establishes prayer at nighttime, Ma'ariv, right, when things are dark and things are not that good. But here we see the beginnings of Yitzchak's struggles, where he is in exile within the land promised to him. In verse 34, after the covenant with the Canaanites here, Esav marries, and he takes 2 wives. Vayikach Isha es Yehudis bas Be'eri Hachiti, a Hittite woman, and Basmas bas Elon Hachiti, another Hittite woman. So he marries at 40, like his father, but marries 2 local women, Hittite women, as opposed to like Rivka. And indeed, Vatiena Moras Ruach Yitzchak or Rivka, and they were of bitter spirit to Yitzchak and Rivka. They were the antithesis of what they were trying to impart to their family, to their children. The 2 wives that Esav brought in were very painful to Yitzchak and Rivka. The next section is a very difficult and a difficult part of the Parsha to learn and understand. And as the Midrash tells us, the Gemara tells us that indeed we suffer today still for some of the tears that Esav had and the wrong that happened. But nevertheless, we have to learn and understand and see what happened and how it happened and why and what we learn from it. So Yitzchak is getting old, and he wants to impart blessing to his children. And this is very much in line with who Yitzchak is. He is the conduit of tefillah, the conduit of blessing from Hashem to the world. That's what this meditation, that's what tefillah is. He brings forth the blessing in having that child. He brings forth the blessing beforehand in the field. And now he's bringing that blessing down, and he wants to bless his children or his son. Now, blessings are not a prayer, and blessings are not a prophecy. They're a blessing. They are the imparting of the blessing that one gets as a conduit of relationship to Hashem to the one that is being blessed. But in order to do so, he says, my son, go and bring some food. I want the blessing to come out of joy and out of a relationship where I do for you because you do for me. Rivka hears this, and she knows that Esav is not the continuation of the Abrahamic line. He's already. They both feel that his choice in the household he's establishing is not right and not a continuation. But what's happening here is that they realize that Yitzchak realizes that still, nevertheless, he as the blesser can give Esav the tools and the means to be able to bring that bracha, that tova, that goodness, and that blessing into the work that Esav does so that he can continue that line. And Rivka thinks, no, that won't help. He is not trained well and in line enough to follow through in the line of what needs to be the father of Am Yisrael. And so she says to Yaakov, you've got to step in and take these blessings. And Yaakov argues and says, it's not going to go. I can't do that, right? And in the end, I'm going to get a curse and not a blessing. So he's arguing with his mother. He's in his 40s already, right? And yet she says, no, you got to do this. Now, my son, listen to my voice and do that which I command to you. Go to the sheep and bring 2 goats, and I will make that which your father likes to eat. And the charade is it's really silly almost, right? He comes in wearing goat skin on his neck and arms, right? His voice sounds like Yaakov. He doesn't talk like Esav talks. And Yitzchak notices that. Right? Because Yitzchak says several times, who are you? Is that really you, Esav? You sound like Yaakov, right? So Yitzchak continuously knows and never refers to him as Esav. He says, my son, my son, my son. Because Yitzchak recognizes there's something, there's something up. This may actually be Yaakov, and goes through with it anyhow. He goes through with the blessing anyhow. So Yitzchak knows he's being had and goes through with it. And Rav Hirsch proposes that perhaps that's what Rivka was trying to do. She wanted Yitzchak to realize that without his eyesight, he really was not astutely aware of what was going on, to the degree that he shouldn't be judging whether or not to bless Esav. Trust me as your wife that how to look at this. I'm clear-sighted about this. But if you look at verse 18, all right, he comes to his father and he says, Avi, my father. And immediately he says, who are you, my son? Right? So he smells the food and but you're Yaakov. It doesn't seem right. And Yaakov says, I am Esav, your eldest. I did as you told me. Please get up and eat from that which I brought for you so that you may bless me. And Yitzchak says to his son, how'd you get here so quickly, my son? Right? So the verse says, and he says to his son, how did you get here, my son? Right? Meaning the verse is saying, I just know you're my son, but I'm actually not sure who you are. Look at, right? That's verse 20. And he responds, Hashem has made me be successful out in the field. Right? And Rashi points out, that's not the way Esav speaks. It's not the way Esav speaks. Please, my father, get up. Hi, father. It's just not, and you see when Esav walks in, it's a very different manner. There's a Hasidic teacher that once asked and said, why didn't he try and imitate Esav? He's wearing all of these clothing of Esav, and why didn't he make it, why didn't he talk like Esav? Because speech is an essential form of the existence of a person. It's an essential, it allows for the inner of the person to come forth. You can change externals, but you cannot change who you are. And Yaakov wouldn't. That was essential to who he is, right? And that's a very powerful idea as well. But he comes out and he says, who are you, my son? Yitzchak says, well, come here. Let me feel you, my son. Again, my son. Are you Esav or not? And Yaakov comes close. He feels him. He says, the voice is that of Esav, of Yaakov, but the hands feel like Esav. And he couldn't tell who he was because he was, and he blessed him. And then he says, Ataz b'ni Esav, are you my son Esav? So he blessed him knowing that he's not sure. And he said, I am. And he said, come, let me eat of that which you've trapped for me, my son. Not Esav, but my son. So that I can bless you. Then he says again in verse 26, come closer to me so I can kiss you, my son. And he came close and he kissed him. And he blessed him and he said, my son, I see your spirit is like the spirit of the field, and which Hashem had blessed. So again, and then he gave the blessing, and we see the blessing, and then Esav. But it is important to recognize that Yaakov didn't fool Yitzchak to think that, into thinking he was Esav. He confused Yitzchak into Yitzchak not knowing what was going on. And Rav Hirsch proposes that's precisely what Rivka was trying to show Yitzchak, that he was being had by Esav because he really was not clear about where Esav was, and that his idea that even though he saw that Esav's choices in life were not in line with the mission of the family of Abraham and then Yitzchak and what would become Am Yisrael, but he thought if I bless him and I give it to him, if I bring that prayer and that bracha through, perhaps that will bring him along to where he needs to be. And Rivka said, no, she cannot. He will not. In any case, the blessing, let's just read that blessing. It's so powerful. Hashem shall give to you, this is in verse 28, in chapter 27, 28. And Hashem shall give for you of the dew of the heavens and of the fats of the earth and the plenty of the grains of the field and of the grapevine and wine. Nations will be of service to you, and all the nationhoods will bow to you, meaning your mission of Abraham and Yitzchak that you will carry, all the nations will bow their head. They will accept that and learn from it. And you will be essentially a light unto the nations. You will be a strength over your brothers, and your mother's children will bow to you, and those that curse you will be cursed, and those that bless you will be blessed. Yaakov leaves, Esav comes in, and he says, what about me, Dad? Right? And he says, I'm sorry, I gave it away to your brother already. Yitzchak here affirms that blessing, saying, look, Gam Baruch Yiyeh. I recognize now what your mother had been trying to tell me, and indeed the blessing is his, and it shall remain his. Yitzchak, in giving over the Abraham lineage and that mission from Abraham to Yitzchak to Yaakov, affirmed that and said, yes, I need to, that should stay. And then he said, well, what about me? Is there anything left for me? And he says, yes, I'll give you some blessing as well. And he says, you will live on fatty lands, and you will have from dew above. You will live by your sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you can, or when he goes down low, you will be able to throw off his yoke from him. He hated him on account of those blessings. And eventually, Rivka says, Yaakov's got to leave to save his life. And she says, I want our son to marry. She goes to Yitzchak and said, please, let's send him off to our family so he can marry. And again, Yitzchak gives the blessing. In chapter 26, verse 3, he says, my son Yaakov, go and find a wife from your mother's family. And verse Ve'el Shaddai Yevarechosecha Ve'yafrecha Ve'arbecha V'Yisrael Kalami, and the mighty one, the one who has put every purpose in the world to its place, will bless you and make you fruitful and plenty, and you will be a community of great nation. V'yiten lecha et birchas Abraham lechal zarach itach, and he will give to you the blessing of Abraham. So here again, he affirms this idea that to Yaakov is the blessing of Abraham, to you and your descendants with you, so that you may inherit this land which was given by Hashem to Abraham. There's one point here that I just want to bring up, and then we'll end with that. When Yaakov leaves and Esav comes in, and Esav says, my father, get up, I have brought you food. Right? Talking like Esav. Look at that. That's in verse 31. It says, I brought your food. Get up, Father, because I brought your food so that you may bless me. And Yitzchak says to him, Miata, who are you? I am your eldest son, Esav. A very powerful next verse, 33. Vayecharad Yitzchak charada gedola admaot. And Yitzchak trembled, a frightening, a tremendous trembling to the very, great trembling. And the Midrash tells us what this trembling is about. Yitzchak had a perspective. For years, we can imagine the conversations between Yitzchak and Rivka. Yitzchak says, I'm so disappointed with Esav and X. And Rivka says, I am too. And Yitzchak says, yeah, but I think he's still gonna, he'll get there. He's there. And Rivka says, I'm concerned. I don't think so. And for years they have this conversation. And Yitzchak is convinced Esav is it is the next generation. Avram, Yitzchak, Esav. That's the way, that's the lineage that's going to go. And he's ready to give the blessing over. In spite of Rivka saying, I don't think so, Yitzchak. I don't think so. And then he realizes she was right. And he trembles. We have so many perspectives that we just take for granted. They're a given to us. This is the truth upon which I build my existence. These are the truths upon which I make my decisions. And then one day we find out that one of them is not correct. And it's so shocking. I've lived so many years and made so many decisions and had so many thoughts built upon something, and it's not correct. So on the one hand, we're happy to learn the truth, but it's such we tremble from that. It shakes us up to the core, because something we have believed to be so essential, core, and true is actually not. And that happened to Yitzchak. The Midrash says, and Rashi quotes it, that when Esav walked in, he felt Gehenna open underneath him. And it is often taken to mean, because Esav walked in, he sort of got a whiff of, Gehenna, of like the destruction of Esav. But if that was the case, that would have happened for years. What it means is he felt it under himself. Oh my goodness, I've been living a mistake on one aspect, at one point that I was so sure I was actually mistaken, right? It's a powerful thing to be able to accept. We usually fight that. We usually fight it vigorously, like, no, I was not wrong, right? And we hold on. But when we do, and if we are strong enough to say, yes, I was mistaken, it does shake us to our core. And that's what happened. Yitzchak had a tremendously great trembling on realizing, I was wrong. I was wrong. We should be able to grow from this. Yitzchak, a very introspective person, a very deep person, the connection with Hashem. And it takes sometimes a lot of difficulty to come to the point where we say, I need to change something because that's just not right. It's a very painful and difficult thing to do, but very powerful. And we can learn that from Yitzchak as well. How it came about, we have a lot to learn as well, right? Much has been said about that. Yeah, the troubles that came about and the curses that came about to Yaakov and Rivka and Am Yisrael for the tears that Esav had because of the stolen blessings, whatever stealing a blessing would mean, right? But because of this trickery. But the end result was the clarity that Yitzchak had and the trembling on account of that shaking up on account of that change.